This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a run through the markets. Now, we'll of course be talking about pharmaceutical stocks in a moment, but first a focus on Sibanye-Stillwater. Its shares closed 1.35% higher in the day. It reported some pretty strong earnings. EBITDA was up over 77% on a year-on-year basis to hit a record level of 19.8 billion rand, roughly $1.39 billion. Spot platinum prices are up by at least 16% so far in the year, and those price trends are informing management's optimism that Q2 will be looking pretty solid as well. Pandemic restrictions notwithstanding, gold and platinum output at that firm did rise. Tesla shares negative so far in the year, down around 7% to $656 at 15:21 GMT. Here's what's coming up tonight. The United States is backing calls for temporary waivers on COVID-19 vaccine patents. South Sudan Central Bank's actions to cushion its currency from depreciating against foreign major currencies are bearing fruit. And we'll tell you why some fishermen along Tanzania's coastline have switched over to coral farming. All that and more is in the pipeline for you tonight. But first, our focus on the business of patents and pharmaceutical firms. The Biden-Harris administration has in the last 24 hours thrown its support behind waiving patents over COVID-19 vaccines. Now, this move follows mounting pressure, not just from Democratic lawmakers, but also from at least 100 other countries as well. It also seems to echo the sentiments of the World Trade Organization Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who has called for an urgent response to ensure a more widespread and equitable access to desperately needed COVID-19 vaccines. Pharmaceutical companies, however, are far from happy with this development. Shares in the vaccine makers Moderna and Novavax were 2.26 and 0.63% lower at 16:55 GMT. Pfizer's shares were nearly 2% lower. On a year-to-date basis, however, they're all positive. Shares in all three are up by at least 53%, 53.8% and 5.4%. respectively. Now, this policy change from the US comes amidst a devastating surge in cases in India, which accounted for 46% of new COVID-19 cases recorded worldwide just last week. The most recent data suggests that cases are rising rapidly as well in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and other neighboring states as well. Now, the World Trade Organization has been in a two-day meeting to discuss whether intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines should be temporarily waived. A proposal to lift vaccine patent protection was put forward by South Africa and India back in October. Here's Angelo Coppola with the latest.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking at a roundtable organised by the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, stressed the importance of the waiver.
As we prepare for future pandemics, we need to accelerate efforts to realize universal health coverage. We need to ensure that vaccines and other life-saving treatments are seen and considered as public goods. Such a waiver will enable more countries to produce COVID-19 vaccines. It will enable us to have diagnostics and treatments to make them more accessible and affordable to poor countries.
The proposal had originally been met with opposition from the United States and Europe. That all changed on Wednesday when the US administration announced their support for the waiver.
But that being said, I think we also need to be pragmatic in terms of what the results of this sort of an outcome would be. Unless there's a clear commitment on the part of the IP holders to actually assist with the technology transfer of the products, the chances of this making a meaningful difference in the immediate future is fairly nominal.
But questions have been raised about the ability of many African countries to produce these vaccines in the short term.
I think the reality for most of Africa is that there's extreme limited ability to produce vaccines from scratch, let alone to be able to go through the full sort of discovery phase in terms of what's required to produce these messenger RNA vaccines, which seems to be the one that is most attractive.
It's going to take anything between 12 to 18 months before there's any meaningful vaccine production capacity on the continent.
But at the same time, it does lend itself to opportunities for other middle-income country manufacturers, especially the many manufacturers in India as well as in China, in Brazil, Indonesia, as an example, where they probably do have the facilities in place.
The US change of heart is good news. It's likely to spur the WTO to move relatively quickly.
And I think especially for the US companies where the US government has invested heavily to get those vaccines through to licensure, the US government is in a position to actually put pressure on those companies to accede.
It appears that the first hurdle has been cleared and everybody's in agreement that waiving those IP rights for the production of COVID vaccines is a good idea. Now we get down to the nitty-gritty and the details. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then let's dig a little deeper into the patent issues at hand. Ivan Sufeli is a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. He joins us now live from Lagos for more analysis. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So for the benefit of our viewers, let's start with defining some terms here. Walk us through what TRIPS is and how it applies in this scenario. Mr. Ofeli, if you can hear me, let's start with the definition of some terms here. Can you walk us through exactly what TRIPS is and how it applies in this particular scenario?
Okay, TRIPS is simply a treaty. It's called the Trade Organization, that is a trade law that deals with intellectual property, the aspect of the trade law that deals with the international intellectual property. Now, it is a very comprehensive agreement, okay, that was signed by members of the WTO to protect intellectual property. So it is quite often referred to as the intellectual property rights that regulates the conduct of members. Now, it was promulgated to protect intellectual property, technology, medicine, patent rights, and the rest of it. And this protection is very important. If you look at Article 13 of the treaty, it states that where there's a copyright intellectual property, it must be enforced for 50 years. And where there's a patent right, it must be enforced for 20 years. But when you look at it, you discover that developing countries are finding it difficult to cope with the provisions. And serious criticisms have gone out that the treaty is being interpreted strictly. And then it is making it difficult for developing countries to have access. For example, the COVID-19 vaccine we talked about, and then at some point in time, the HIV vaccine. It is becoming very difficult for these developing countries to have access to it for its production because of the intellectual property rights preservation that is required. And some time ago, India and South Africa have made formal application for there to be a kind of deregulation so that there will be access for developing countries to have a positive access to this and have it in a way that they could manufacture this vaccine and have it in area. Because COVID-19 took the world as a storm. It's a health emergency. And as such, it is required. But the G7, have opposed this, saying that the intellectual property rights and laws must remain, irrespective of the medical emergency and the COVID-19 problem that is all over the world. But when you look at it from the side of law,
firms, though,
an agreement
pharmaceutical firms have expressed their opposition to giving this waiver. But do they have any legal options to stop this process outside of the WTO? Or is the WTO the only location where they can actually go there and say, no, we're actually opposed to this, stop it?
Well, it has to do with trade. So the WTO is actually the jurisdiction of the WTO, okay? And since it has to do with trade within member states, okay, there are no legal options outside the treaty because it is a very comprehensive treaty, okay? And then at some point when the developing countries criticized it to a point, it led in 2001 to the Doha Declaration, which now restated clearly the position of TRIPS. And then since then, it has been that way such that the developed countries still want that preservation of the intellectual property, because if it is waived, there is this fear that it might lead to further conflict. It might lead to further conflict in terms of the law regulating the said organization. So I think that both arguments, one coming from the side of emergency and giving it a human face, is valid. And then the argument that also say that an agreement, a statute, a treaty of that magnitude that is so comprehensive should also be preserved to preserve world organization, world trade. And it is important that we extend this discourse to the fact that if you take off the intellectual property right, okay, waive it off, you are going to still confront certain problems, because some of the developing countries, there is no guarantee that they may have the capacity to manage even the waiver. So you may have crisis in the waiver. And at the same time, if you preserve the intellectual property right, you could also have this emergency. Like in India now, there is a third wave case. And in some other countries that are facing the second wave and the third wave COVID-19 crisis. So what I think we should do is to explore the option again of that treaty. Possibly 100 countries already voted for the waiver, but the G7, who happens to be the harbinger of the entire trust, have kicked against it to say that the intellectual property right must remain. So it is, we are in a dilemma now until there is a renegotiation of the treaty and possibly some amendments or some consideration. Then it will remain that way until we find a very good way to work around it.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Evans Ufeli joining us there live from Lagos. Thank you for your time. Time now for a run through some company headlines. Let's start in Zambia. Zambia's Konkola copper mine, or KCM, has denied claims that the mine has been temporarily shut down. Earlier on, news reports did claim that Zambia had halted production because of a lack of funds needed to develop new mining areas. The country's economy is heavily reliant on mining, particularly of copper. That makes the sector highly sensitive, particularly as the country is heading into a general election in barely 12 weeks. Still in the world of commodities, Total has started production at its Zinia Phase 2 project in Angola. Production levels are estimated at least 65 million barrels of crude over the lifetime of the project. Total says that the development of the project was carried out on schedule. Total capital expenditure came in more than 10% below budget, saving at least $150 million. That includes a cost of drilling 9 wells. Oil output is expected to reach at least 40,000 barrels of crude a day by the middle of 2022. Moody's says it has placed First Bank of Nigeria on review for downgrade after Nigeria's central bank sacked the board of the lender and its parent firm and then appointed new directors. According to Moody's, the review will focus on an assessment of the evolving governance situation at First Bank. Early in the week, First Bank reported a 33% decline in net earnings in Q1 to just over $34 million compared to a year earlier. And finally, in the world of vehicle manufacturers, Europe's largest car maker, Volkswagen, has raised its operating margin target for 2021 to anywhere between 5.5% to 7%. That's mainly driven by improved demand for high-margin premium products from its Porsche and Audi brands. The trend has also been observed by its main rivals, General Motors, Daimler and Ford. Volkswagen's operating profit came in at $5.8 billion in the first quarter, supported by a combination of cost cuts and higher sales. That's a run through your company headlines. We're 15 minutes into the hour. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up. Financial services companies are facing a lot more diverse risks than just the COVID-19 pandemic. And South African Airways troubled subsidiary Mango is looking to Treasury to stay afloat. The details coming up shortly. Its effects are surreal, but its existence is undeniable. Mother Nature is fighting back against a species that is destroying it.
We're here to raise our voices. We know that climate change has already started and it's killing us.
It hurts.
Amid the tears and the grief, however, there is hope for resolution.
We need to live in harmony with nature.
We focus on the deeds, the deals, and the people working to make a difference. This is Surviving Climate Change, only on CGTN. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now, a new report by the Global Corporate and Specialty Insurance Unit at Allianz says that the COVID-19 pandemic is far from being the only risk facing insurers and the financial sector as a whole. A report that they just put out analyzed just over $1 billion or so of claims in the financial sector. Its authors found that cybersecurity incidents, including various forms of cybercrime, are the top cause of loss. Insurers see a rising number of losses from outages or privacy breaches, with third-party service providers being a growing weak link. It also adds that compliance issues are already one of the biggest drivers for claims, and that burden is growing, particularly around economic, social and governance factors and claims related to climate change too. Let's examine this in a bit more detail. Julien Supitier is the Product Development Manager at Allianz, who joins us now live from Paris. Julien, thank you very much for your time. So as firms are considering getting more and more of their employees working back in the office, how are they and the insurers thinking through how they will handle the evolving matrix of potential liability from COVID-19 infections?
Thank you very much for receiving me and also for your question. I must say that this topic of return to the office is clearly one of these topics that comes with a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is something that we highlighted in our latest report. At this stage, the infection seems to persist, and in many countries, we are facing and we expect to face for at least some additional months measures restricting freedom of movement. And this is not something that is specific to financial services. Having said this, at the moment where the return to the office will become more effective, this will bring a lot of issues that go from, for example, COVID-19 infection liability to privacy issues. For example, let's take the situation of the health of an employee, or another topic could be, for example, vaccination. To what extent an employer may be able to ask or decide that he will accept his employees back only after vaccination. All these topics are for the moment not completely solved, and we are not in a situation where we have the information to exactly assess the potential liabilities. For example, the question of vaccinating employees raises the parallel question of what happens with the safety of those employees that are not vaccinated. All these risks, and this is probably what is the good information at this stage, are already taken into consideration by companies, and they are taken into consideration also by the board of directors as we speak. So we know that those liabilities are somewhere out there, but everyone is working around them to finally identify how and to what extent you can mitigate those.
Okay, so one of the other things that came up in the report was that this growing concentration risk among third-party service providers, because a lot more banks, a lot more insurance companies are now relying on third-party entities to provide some of their core services. So how then can you ensure against that risk that comes with a third party providing critical services, like we saw in the SolarWinds hack, for instance?
Well, this is a very interesting question. At one moment, cybersecurity experts warned that COVID-19 would be what we call a perfect storm for financial services as a result of unplanned remote working, fast adoption of new technologies, and potentially weaker controls and oversight. And as a matter of fact, at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, cyber attacks increased by more than 200%. But once we said this, the picture is not desperate because, for example, in many cases, if not most of them, cyber attacks include a human element. So training and technology help minimize this error. In this respect, your employees, for example, are your first line of defense of every company. They are the most important part of the cybersecurity team. And the same applies to top management because they are here to build a resilience and a business continuity planning. And it's interesting to see, and this is something that is very specific to financial institutions, is that at this stage, they are still a target of choice, despite having one of the highest levels of security spend. Going forward and coming back to your question, I would say that how financial institutions manage risk presented by the cloud will be critical. If you partner with the right cloud service provider, this is how you manage your cyber exposure, both from a company perspective and from an insurance perspective.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Julien from Allianz, thank you very much for your time this evening. Now then, let's move away from the world of finance and into Africa's youngest state. South Sudan's pound has strengthened slightly against the American dollar a month after the country's central bank started to auction $5 million a week to commercial banks and forex bureaus in the capital, Juba. Officials over there trying to reduce inflation in the import-dependent country. But many residents in the capital say the prices of goods still remain pretty high. Here's CGTN's Patrick Oyet with the latest.
Sylvia Morogo is a single mother of 5. She has no permanent job and relies on work such as washing clothes for people. But South Sudan's government has not paid civil servants for 5 months. So many here don't have money to pay people like Sylvia what they are owed.
Until when are we, the poor, going to suffer? We voted for this country to become independent. We are now independent, but I am unable to buy food for my children. My children are hungry. They cannot go to school. Why am I even alive then?
Paying for goods in the market has been hard for people to afford, while prices have been rising.
Prices should reduce. The price of meat and other foods are very high. Our currency is getting stronger against the dollar, but food is expensive for a single mother like me. I'm suffering.
South Sudan Central Bank borrowed $174.2 million from the International Monetary Fund in March. The bank is now providing $3 million weekly to commercial banks, another $2 million to foreign exchange forexes. It says it hopes the hard currency will bring a positive change in the economy.
Our role as a central bank is the stability of general price level. That's our role. And we feel the main factor that influences that in South Sudan now is exchange rate, because we are importing most of the essential commodities. And therefore, generally, we can say if we can stabilize the exchange rate, or if the pound can strengthen, then definitely there is no reason why general price level cannot come down.
Bank of South Sudan began providing the hard currency to commercial banks and foreign exchange businesses early last month. Many traders here say they are not yet convinced that the exchange rate will remain stable for long, and many are maintaining prices they set before the local currency began gaining value against the US dollars. The economy is ailing as a result of years of civil war, limited production, and negative effects of COVID-19. The civil society group says more needs to be done.
whatever is happening right now may not necessarily provide a long-term solution. This is simply a short-term solution. It's because when you want to stabilize your economy, you cannot stabilize your economy by borrowed money. You need to stabilize your economy by your ability to be able to generate your own money.
For many South Sudanese people like Sylvia Morogo, their highest priority is to see prices come down and work become available so they can feed and educate their children. Despite the recent improvement in the strength of the currency, that goal remains far off for some. Patrick Koyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
Some aviation news now. South African Airways subsidiary companies are anxiously awaiting government funding. The Treasury announced in Parliament this week that $190,000 would be made available to the low-cost carrier Mango, SA Chef and SA Technical. But as CGTN Sumitra Naidu now reports, that money still needs to be cleared.
It's been touch and go for Mango Airlines, which is 100% owned by SAA. The low-cost carrier was locked out of the country's main airports last week after it failed to pay rent. It was back on the runway after managing to pay some of its debt. The airline is broke.
When DPE made this promise, there was this very high expectation from our members that they would now finally be getting their salaries in full. And when that money ceased to materialize, they threatened to go on strike. We had to actually intervene and stop them from going on strike.
The technicalities of yet another bailout for SAA has left Mango and the other subsidiaries scrambling to stay operational. But the Treasury announced this week that $574,000 has been allocated to SAA's subsidiaries.
This budget has been one of the most difficult budgets we had to do. So in the past, we had to do a fiscal consolidation, but we would be looking at numbers ranging between 15 to 20 billion. In other years, we're looking at 10 billion. But what we are facing right now is a budget reduction of 300 billion.
In the coming weeks, Parliament will conduct public hearings on the appropriations bill tabled by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. The bill legislates the funding of the COVID vaccine, the grant for distressed people due to COVID, as well as the recapitalization of South African Airways and its subsidiaries.
The Appropriation Act was drafted was that the 10 billion or the 10.5 billion cannot be used for anything else other than the business rescue. And within that business rescue, the department had some of the support of 2.7 billion to their subsidiaries. So what we are asking here, Chairperson, is that we earmark a 2.7 billion from the business rescue, and we allow the Department of Public Enterprises and SAA to transfer the funding.
Mango continues to fly for now, but if the money allocated to it by government doesn't arrive soon, it may have to suspend operations until it does clear. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Tanzania's national carrier, in the meantime, has started operations on a new route between its commercial capital of Dar es Salaam and the Chinese city of Guangzhou. The maiden flight is scheduled to take off this weekend. This comes after months of delays due to restrictions imposed to contain the spread of COVID-19. CGTN's Daniel Kijo takes up the story.
Air Tanzania is looking to start flying into one of China's busiest cities, Guangzhou. Flights are expected to start on May 8th. This comes after multiple postponements since September of 2020 as a result of COVID-19, which forced airlines to stop operations. Air Tanzania's management says the route comes in response to the demand from mainly Chinese passengers. If the demand keeps growing, more flights may be added.
We had requested to go there once a week, so we can add flights later. But we were told we can go once every 2 weeks for now. We believe later we will be allowed to go once a week, because one flight every 2 weeks is not a very friendly timetable.
The airline will fly twice a month, but carrying primarily Chinese passengers. There will be a few exceptions for Tanzanians with student visas or with special medical needs.
The only passengers who can fly on this flight are Chinese who are living in Tanzania, can go back to China, and Chinese people can come to Tanzania. The embassy, we understand, is still not issuing business visas to China, so Tanzanians cannot go to China.
Making it to Guangzhou requires multiple COVID-19 screenings. Due to the recent rise of COVID-19 variants, passengers will have to undergo 3 COVID-19 tests before receiving a green declaration card from the Embassy of China. Despite the challenges, experts say the trips are a catalyst for boosting trade, tourism, and employment.
Guangzhou, I think it is the focal destination for Tanzanian business people, and we hope that things will ease up with this COVID, and Tanzanians will be able to fly to Guangzhou and undertake the business tasks.
Air Tanzania has suffered a challenging time over the last few decades involving allegations of mismanagement. The government, under late President John Magufuli, initiated a new drive in 2017 to revive the airline by adding brand new aircrafts and introducing new routes. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
We're taking a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. China suspends a key economic dialogue mechanism with Australia. And Netflix premieres Italy's first all-black cast movie.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. Let's run through some of the stories making headlines at this hour. The International Criminal Court has sentenced a former Ugandan warlord, Dominic Ongwen, to 25 years behind bars for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ongwen is the first member of the Lord's Resistance Army rebel group to appear before the court. Elsewhere, Libya's Foreign Minister Najla Al-Mangush has called on Turkey to implement UN Security Council resolutions demanding the repatriation of foreign fighters and mercenaries. Her remarks came during a joint press conference with the Turkish Foreign Minister. Turkey was militarily involved in Libya's civil conflict. It backed the former UN-recognized government of national accord. The Counter-Terrorism Office in France has started an investigation into the disappearance of a French journalist in Mali. Olivier Dubois has been missing for a month, but in a video published on Wednesday, he's shown calling on his family, friends and authorities to secure his release. And finally, in Nigeria, 27 students from a college in Kaduna State have been freed by their abductors. The students were released on Wednesday and they were part of the 37 abducted in March from the Federal College of Forestry Mechanization. 10 of them had been released earlier in 2 batches. All of the students have now regained their freedom. That's a run through your headlines. Now, the first China International Consumer Products Expo will open on Friday in the country's Hainan province. The expo is part of China's efforts to enhance the status of Hainan's free trade port and to promote the government's commitment to opening up. CGTN's Dong Shui explains why this Southern Island province was chosen to host this event and what overseas companies and domestic consumers can expect.
fashion, jewelry, automobiles, you name it. With a total exhibition area of 80,000 square meters, China's inaugural International Consumer Products Expo is set to be the largest in the Asia-Pacific region.
The COVID-19 pandemic has hit China and many other countries hard, but they're starting to think once again to the future. Where better to look than this expo in Hainan. But you might wonder why this southern Chinese island in particular.
While the world has a host of free trade and special economic zones, few can compare to Hainan. First of all, it's being designated a free trade port, which gives it many more freedoms. And although it's an island, Hainan is big, much bigger in size than, say, Hong Kong or Singapore. And the free trade port will include all of this island. And then there's its geographic position, right there between the Chinese mainland and the ever-expanding economies of Southeast Asia. China and ASEAN's partnership is expanding every year, and President Xi Jinping has even acclaimed its potential, saying last year a diamond decade lay ahead. The port was only established last June, but its special policies in terms of tax breaks and the scrapping of tariffs are already attracting overseas interest.
And it's not just about companies. Ordinary people can also benefit from the free trade port. Take this expo as an example.
Apart from made-in-China products, hundreds of overseas exhibitors and more than 1,000 global brands are here with their latest and finest consumer products. These include Swatch from Switzerland, L'Oreal from France, and Dell, Tesla, and Coach from the United States.
China hopes the expo can help the world learn more about the sheer potential of Hainan. It's a long-term project with opportunities and challenges along the way, but by 2015, it's hoped Hainan will have its structures in place compared to free trade hubs like Hong Kong and Singapore.
Authorities in China say they're suspending a key economic dialogue mechanism with Australia. The National Development and Reform Commission says it's stopping talks under the Strategic Economic Dialogue framework in response to recent actions taken by Australia. Canberra recently cancelled 2 Belt and Road agreements between China and the state of Victoria. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman was asked about Beijing's decision at a press conference earlier on Thursday. This was his response.
For some time now, in spite of China's solemn position and repeated negotiations, Australia has abused the so-called national security reasons to restrict and suppress projects and achievements in economy and trade, humanities and other fields. This has seriously damaged mutual trust and the basis of normal exchanges and cooperation. China will take necessary and legitimate countermeasures, and Australia must bear the responsibility for this.
Now, ties between the two sides started to go south in 2018 after Canberra banned Huawei from providing hardware and software for building out 5G networks in the country. Tensions continued last year when Australia imposed anti-dumping duties on some Chinese products, and multiple incidents of discrimination against Chinese students were also reported. As we've just mentioned, in April, Australia cancelled 2 deals struck by the state of Victoria with China under the Belt and Road Initiative, and that in turn prompted the Chinese embassy in the country to warn about worsening ties. In the 12 months to March, Australia has exported roughly $115 billion worth of goods to China, and that number excludes service exports. On to Europe now. The Netflix series Zero is the first Italian TV production ever to feature a predominantly black cast. The protagonists of the show hope that the series, which focuses on second-generation black Italians, will accelerate public acceptance that Italy is a multicultural nation. The series had its global premiere in April. It's seen as a bright spot in a rather bleak Italian television landscape, where the persistent use of racist language and imagery is sparking new protests. The main state broadcaster, Rai, for example, is under fire for attempting to censor an Italian rapper's remarks, highlighting homophobia in a right-wing political party.
This is what I want to do. If you ask these children who is in front of them, they'll never tell you. The first black Italian actor. They will tell you a superhero, or they'll tell you Dave. So this is what we have to do. This is what needs to be done.
When I was little, it was difficult to find someone who was similar to me or who could represent who I am. I couldn't find that in Italy. I had to look abroad. So I looked at many sitcoms and American TV series, but I was a bit disappointed. In the world today, even in Italy, there are a lot of second-generation blacks, and this community is very strong. But we are not represented in cinema. So to be a part of a series with a black story is a huge victory for me.
A quick run through commodity prices before we jump into the break. You know what they say about a rising tide lifting all boats? At $151, coffee futures in the US, they're essentially back to where they were in December 2019. Pre-pandemic, if you might recall what that was like. Brent crude approached $69 a barrel, but it's not quite cracked that $70 a barrel level decisively so far this year. Nonetheless, it's up by nearly 33%. S&P Platts had an interesting report today. Russia and Iraq responsible for most of the overproduction in the OPEC Plus grouping in the first quarter of the year, to the tune of 3.3 million barrels a day. Russia is pumping about 900,000 barrels a day, rather, well over its quota, according to that report. Time for a break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore why some fishermen in Tanzania have switched to coral farming. That story is coming up next.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Tunisia. Officials from the International Monetary Fund have welcomed the economic reform program proposed by the North African state's government. Tunisia is seeking funding from the Washington-based lender to kickstart the recovery of a tourism and travel-reliant economy battered by the pandemic. Here's CGTN's Arin Chouachi with this update from Tunis.
Authorities in Tunisia are hopeful of a new financing program from the International Monetary Fund in ongoing talks to help the country's troubled economy. Tunisia's first reform strategy is based on setting up a new legal framework of governance and control, the improvement of state enterprises management through the revision of the portfolio of state holdings, and the creation of a public shareholding agency is among the government's new commitments with the IMF.
We need the International Monetary Fund financing because the IMF can give more credibility to the government work. The IMF Managing Director noted that Tunisia has implemented efficient measures as part of the strategic reform plan. Telling the truth about our economy, providing real and detailed data is necessary. We cannot improve our situation without evaluating state enterprises.
Top officials from Tunisia's government are holding talks with the IMF, where the governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia presented a 3-year strategic reform plan. It includes a new project aimed at greater efficiency in the governance mode of its monetary policy.
In the past, Tunisia failed to honor its commitments to the IMF because we used to seek financing, while the reforms were imposed onto the government. Now we are negotiating on the basis of deep reforms we've drafted, conceived, and made possible by working with the central bank and all economic stakeholders.
The reform program stipulates that the government will reduce the public sector wage. It will also evaluate and adjust the economic models of the state-owned enterprises. Authorities will select priority enterprises and sectors requiring operational and financial restructuring. The plan will also aim at phasing out subsidies and trimming the public wage bill.
I have informed all ministries about the need to facilitate the implementation of the reform program. This is the right way to put in place the project of economic revival. Reforming public and state-owned companies is a top priority. Their situation is very difficult. The reform plan has been developed in consultation with our social partners and the labor union.
The Tunisian delegation visiting Washington also pledged to strengthen the regulatory framework to combat corruption and anti-competitive practices in the North African country. Tunisian Minister of Economy informed IMF officials that his government aims to improve the business and investment climate. Tunisia plans to reduce bureaucratic procedures, digitize public administration and control financial balances as authorities seek to get targeted financial support from the IMF. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Now, Africa's eastern coastline teems with abundant coral reefs and marine life, and that makes the waters of the island of Zanzibar an aquatic paradise of sorts. But in recent years, the reefs over there are being threatened by climate change. Many are starting, in fact, to bleach and die. The disappearance of these coral reefs also will affect the fishermen and the livelihoods that are built around this aquatic environment. In order to protect the ocean, a group of locals have now switched over from fishing to coral farming. This is their story.
Naitwa Abdi Mjaka Haji, nimezaliwa Makunduchi na naishi Jambiani. Nipo Jambiani takribani miaka 26 mpaka sasa hivi. Na naipenda bahari kwa sababu toka utotoni kwangu kama nilivyokuwa nachukuliwa na babangu kwenda baharini, kwenda kuona mambo mengi ndani ya bahari. Nikaamua kujishughulisha na harakati zangu za maisha kama vile kuvua kwanza, na nilikuwa nachukuliwa na babangu kwenda kuvua. Nilisikia tu kuwa kuna mzungu anaanzisha mradi fulani wa kuweka kama hifadhi za samaki baharini. Baadaye nikaamua tu kujiunga na mradi wa marine culture ili kujua baadhi ya mambo kwenye bahari.
Marine culture has been founded in 2008 as an NGO in Switzerland and as a branch here in Zanzibar, Tanzania. And since this, we have several projects in aquaculture development and conservation. We try to give an opportunity to people to learn the coral farming and the coral restoration.
Kabla ya kuja hapa, nilikuwa sijui nini coral. Lakini nilipoanza tu kuenda baharini nikajua coral ni nini. ilikuwa mara yangu ya kwanza kudive, baada ya kuona zile coral kufa nilijisikia vibaya sana.
Started to do coral gardening or growing corals to create jobs for the fishermen. The idea was to sell the products to the aquarium market. But then the climate catastrophe came. It was an El Nino year in 2016 that all our corals died.
Matumbawe hutengenezwa na wanyama wadogo wadogo ambao wanaitwa polyps. Ambao hawaonekani kwa macho mpaka kwa vifaa maalum vya kisayansi. Coral ni kiumbe hai kama vilivyo viumbe hai vingine, kwa maana coral inakula, inaishi na pia zinazaa. Au kipindi cha jua kali, maji yanapokuwa moto na coral pia inachuja rangi na baadaye kufa kabisa. Matumbawe hayo hutengenezwa kitu ambacho kinaitwa mwamba wa matumbawe, ambao mwamba huo huvutia wanyama wadogo wadogo na kufanya kama ni makazi yao, na baadaye wavuvi huwa wanakuja kwenye mwamba huo na kujipatia riziki zao za kuvua samaki kwenye mwamba huo wa matumbawe. Kwa sasa tupo katika soko la samaki ambalo ni la Malindi, na tunajionea jinsi gani samaki wanapopatikana kwa wingi, lakini isitoshe tupo katika samaki wanaopatikana kwa wingi au wanaocheza katika maeneo ya coral ni changu peke yake ambayo ndio anayopatikana kwa wingi, na wanakuwa ni vivutio kwa samaki wakubwa kama tuna au red snapper na wengineo. Lakini vile vile kwa sasa hivi samaki hawapatikani kwa kiasi kikubwa kwa sababu hali ya matumbawe imetoweka au imepotea kabisa. Na tuliamua kuotesha miche ya coral na kurejesha katika hali zao za kawaida. Tunakuwa tunaenda baharini kwa kulinda haya matumbawe. tunakuwa tunapanda coral. Tunaziweka kwenye diski. Na baadaye wiki moja au wiki mbili zinakuwa tayari zishakamata ile diski na zinakuwa tayari zishakuwa kidogo. Takriban mwezi mmoja au miezi miwili tayari zishakuwa za kwenda kutransplanti. Baadhi ya siku zinakuwa zipo chafu, kama zinaingia kama majani fulani hivi, tunachukua miswaki na tunasafisha kwa ajili ya kuwa nzuri zaidi.
This is an ongoing program, so we plant nearly 10,000 new corals every year. And especially we are looking for a high amount of biodiversity, adapt from the nature.
Mpaka sasa hivi nipo hapa marine culture kwa ajili ya kuilinda bahari, na nahakikisha nitailinda bahari mpaka watoto wangu au wajukuu zangu au hata ndugu majirani nao pia wajionee kilichomo ndani ya bahari kama vile coral na samaki.
Let's run through the currencies as we wrap up the program. The Kenyan shilling continued to post gains against the American dollar. In fact, at today's levels, it's up around 2.3% against the dollar. That takes it back to levels that we saw around July last year, at least in the official interbank market. On the debt side, Kenya Central Bank did reopen two bonds for sale yesterday, a 15 and a 25-year note, due in 2034 and 2046 respectively. The central bank did get at least 141% of the bids it was looking for. It was looking to raise about $277 million in that particular auction. The coupon rates on those notes, 12.7 and 13.9% respectively. Those are your currencies, and that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today's up next from Washington, D.C.